I keep replaying that night in my head, not because I want to, but because I can't seem to shut it off. The annual summer charity gala at Briarwood Heights Country Club is supposed to be the kind of event where couples show up polished and united, smiling too wide for photos and pretending everything is exactly how it should be. Olivia and I had attended every year since we moved to suburban Ohio, and this one was supposed to be different. It marked 7 years of marriage. I had a folded speech in the inside pocket of my blazer, creased carefully so it wouldn't ruin the line of the fabric. I spent an entire week rewriting it, trying to strike that balance between heartfelt and not overly sentimental, between gratitude and hope. I genuinely believed we were just going through a rough patch and that this night could be a reset. Earlier that evening, before the band even started playing, I quietly asked her not to dance with Derek Shaw. I had seen him before at other events, always orbiting her like he was waiting for a gap in my attention. She called him a guy from her spin class, said I was reading too much into it. I told her it wasn't about jealousy for the sake of it, it was about respect. The way he looked at her made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue much, which I took as a sign that she understood. Then the slow music started. I was across the room talking to one of the board members when I saw them. Derek had his hand resting low on her back, lower than what felt appropriate for something that was supposed to be innocent. Her head tilted back slightly as she laughed at something he said, and when he spun her, the chandelier lights caught her wedding ring and made it flash like a signal. It felt cruelly symbolic, that tiny band of gold shining while she let another man guide her across the floor. The look on her face was what really did it. It wasn't just friendly. It wasn't polite. It was soft, open, almost electric. I realized I hadn't seen her look at me like that in years. I walked up to them calmly. I didn't make a scene. I didn't grab her arm or raise my voice. I just leaned in slightly and said, as evenly as I could, "Can you not?" That was it. 2 words. She looked at me like I had interrupted something trivial, something amusing. Then she laughed. Not an awkward laugh, not a nervous one. A genuine, almost incredulous laugh. "What's going to happen, Nate? It's just dancing." The words weren't loud, but they carried. Derek smirked slightly, the kind of expression that pretends to be polite but isn't. In that moment, I felt small. Not angry in a loud explosive way, but hollow. Dismissed. Like my discomfort was entertainment. Like I was the unreasonable one for expecting my wife to choose me in that very basic, public way. I stepped back. I remember nodding once, like I had just accepted the outcome of some internal debate. I didn't argue. I didn't try again. I walked to the edge of the ballroom, past the round tables covered in white linen and half-finished glasses of wine, past couples swaying close together. I could still see them in my peripheral vision, moving in rhythm. I reached into my pocket and felt the folded paper of my speech. 7 years. I had written about loyalty, about choosing each other every day, about weathering seasons. Suddenly it felt naive. I left before the song ended. I didn't say goodbye. The night air outside was thick and humid, and I remember standing in the parking lot longer than necessary, staring at my reflection in the dark window of my car. I didn't cry. I didn't punch anything. Something in me just went quiet. Not broken in a dramatic way, not shattered. Just muted. Like a switch had been flipped and a part of me that used to reach for her simply stopped trying. The next morning felt surreal in a way that almost made me question my own memory of the night before. Sunlight poured into the kitchen through the wide windows, too bright and cheerful for how heavy my chest felt. I came downstairs expecting tension, or at the very least an awkward silence. Instead, Olivia was standing at the stove in leggings and one of my old college t-shirts, humming along to some upbeat pop song playing from her phone. The smell of cinnamon waffles filled the house, warm and sweet, like a staged version of domestic bliss. For a split second, I wondered if she was going to turn around, look at me, and say we needed to talk about last night. She didn't. She smiled casually and asked if I wanted extra syrup, like we had just returned from an uneventful dinner. There was no flicker of guilt in her expression, no hesitation in her movements. When I didn't respond right away, she glanced at me and tilted her head slightly, almost amused. Then she said I embarrassed her by sulking and leaving early. She said it lightly, as if I had overreacted to something trivial, as if I had ruined her evening for no good reason. The word sulking stuck in my head because it reduced everything I felt to something childish and petty. I sat down at the kitchen island and finally asked her who he really was. I kept my tone controlled, steady, even though my pulse had started climbing again. She poured herself coffee, took a sip, and said, "Oh, relax, Derek? He's harmless. The way she said his name so easily, like it rolled off her tongue from frequent use, hit harder than watching them dance. Derek. Not the guy from spin class. Not some vague acquaintance. Just Derek. Familiar. Comfortable. I watched her carefully when she said it, looking for any sign that she understood why this bothered me. There was none. Instead, she sighed and leaned against the counter like she was the reasonable one in the room. Then she said it. "You're being dramatic." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was dismissive, clinical, like she had diagnosed me with an overreaction and was closing the case. Something in me shifted right then. Up until that moment, I had still been hoping for a simple acknowledgement. A small admission that maybe it crossed a line. An apology that didn't have to be dramatic, just real. When I asked her how it looked, publicly slow dancing with another man after I had already told her I was uncomfortable, she smirked. Actually smirked. The corner of her mouth lifted in this subtle, superior way that made my stomach tighten. "You act like I cheated," she said, as if the only definition of betrayal that counted was physical. As if emotional disrespect in front of a room full of people meant nothing. I realized then that we weren't arguing about dancing. We were arguing about perception, and she was trying to rewrite mine. She reframed my discomfort as insecurity, my hurt as immaturity, my request for boundaries as control. There was no apology because, in her mind, she had done nothing wrong. The narrative had already been adjusted so that I was the one who needed to recalibrate. I stopped arguing not because I accepted her version of events, but because I saw how confident she was in it. She genuinely believed she was several steps ahead of me, that if she minimized it enough and labeled me dramatic, I would eventually question myself. The calm in her voice wasn't peace, it was calculation. She buttered her waffle, scrolling through her phone, completely at ease, while I sat there realizing that the issue wasn't one dance or one man named Derek. It was the fact that my feelings had become negotiable, debatable, even laughable. That quiet feeling from the parking lot the night before returned, heavier this time. Not explosive anger, not yelling, just a steady internal withdrawal. I looked at her across the counter and understood something uncomfortable. She wasn't confused about my boundaries. She simply didn't respect them. And worse, she seemed convinced that I would eventually accept whatever version of reality she handed me. 3 days after the breakfast conversation, I found myself walking down a quiet street in downtown Wilmington, staring up at a modest brick building with a striped awning over a bakery on the ground floor. The smell of fresh bread and sugar drifted into the cold morning air, strangely comforting given the reason I was there. Above that bakery, up a narrow set of stairs with slightly worn wooden steps, was the office of Madeline Pierce, a divorce attorney whose name had been given to me by a colleague who described her as discreet, strategic, and calm under pressure. I remember pausing halfway up the stairs, my hand resting on the railing, acknowledging to myself that simply being there meant something had shifted permanently. I did not walk into her office declaring that I wanted a divorce. I did not speak in absolutes. When I sat across from her, in a softly lit office with shelves of neatly organized legal binders and a large window overlooking the street, I kept my voice steady and measured. I told her I needed information. I told her I was not looking to start a war. Then I asked the only question that had been circling in my head since that morning over coffee. What does a clean exit look like? She did not look surprised. She did not lean forward eagerly or react dramatically. She simply folded her hands on the desk and began asking practical questions. Assets. Liabilities. Length of marriage. Children. I answered each one carefully. 7 years married. No kids. A house valued around $780,000 in a suburb that had appreciated steadily. A lake cabin in Michigan that we bought 2 summers ago, framed as an investment and a retreat. Joint brokerage accounts that had grown quietly over time, diversified, healthy. Retirement funds. Vehicles. Nothing flashy, nothing reckless. On paper, it was the kind of balanced, stable financial picture that couples build when they expect to stay together. Saying those details out loud in that office felt clinical, almost detached. Numbers replaced memories. The house was no longer the place where we hosted holidays, it was an asset subject to division. The lake cabin was not mornings on the dock with coffee, it was property acquired during the marriage. The brokerage accounts were no longer shared plans for the future, they were figures to be calculated and potentially split. It was unsettling how quickly emotion could be stripped away and translated into percentages. Madeline listened more than she spoke, occasionally making notes in a yellow legal pad. When she did offer insight, it was measured. She explained how Ohio courts typically approached asset division in marriages without children, how documentation mattered, how timing mattered even more. There was no encouragement to act impulsively. Instead, she gave me something far more valuable than urgency. She gave me perspective. At one point, after I had finished outlining everything we owned, she looked at me and said something that lodged itself firmly in my mind. Take your time. The person who thinks everything is fine is usually the least prepared. She did not say it with malice. It was not advice rooted in revenge. It was strategy grounded in experience. In that moment, I understood that preparation was not about punishment. It was about control, about not being blindsided. I left her office with a business card tucked into my wallet, the edges sharp and deliberate against the leather. Walking back past the bakery, the sweetness in the air felt almost ironic. On the outside, my life still looked intact. My wife believed the gala had been a minor disagreement. She believed our breakfast conversation had settled into normalcy. She moved through our home as if stability were guaranteed. As I got into my car, I realized that what I had gained in that office was not a decision, but clarity. I was no longer reacting emotionally to a dance or a smirk or a dismissive word. I was assessing. Quietly. Methodically. I had not declared an end. I had asked about an exit. And in doing so, I felt that same internal quiet return, but this time it was different. It was not hollow. It was focused. After meeting with the attorney, I made a decision that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with posture. I stopped trying to convince Olivia of anything. I stopped replaying arguments out loud. I stopped asking for reassurance that was clearly not going to come. Instead of fighting her version of reality, I began quietly restructuring my own. The change was subtle at first, almost invisible unless someone was looking closely. I upgraded my wardrobe piece by piece, tailored jackets instead of loose ones, shirts that actually fit my frame, shoes polished instead of practical. I started going to the gym earlier in the mornings, not in some dramatic transformation arc, but with consistent discipline. I cut back on the small habits that made me feel stagnant. I didn't announce any of it. I just did it. More importantly, I stopped chasing her for explanations. When she mentioned Derek in passing one evening, laughing at something from spin class, I didn't tense up or interrogate. I nodded and continued reading. When she went out, I didn't ask who would be there. When she came home, I didn't scan her face for clues. The absence of reaction unsettled her more than any argument ever had. I could see it in the way she occasionally studied me, like she was waiting for the old version of me to resurface, the one who would challenge her and demand clarity. That version stayed quiet. The real shift happened at the next neighborhood mixer a couple of weeks later. These events were usually predictable. Couples clustering in familiar groups, subtle comparisons disguised as friendly conversation. In the past, I would have stayed close to Olivia, orbiting the same social circle, monitoring dynamics I didn't trust. This time, I did the opposite. I moved through the room independently, shaking hands, engaging in conversations about work, travel, investments. I listened more. I laughed easily. I didn't look over my shoulder to see where she was every few minutes. I acted like a man who was comfortable standing alone. That was when I met Hannah Blake, a visiting cousin of one of our neighbors who was in town for a few weeks. She had an easy smile and a straightforward way of speaking that felt refreshingly uncomplicated. We ended up talking about Michigan lakes after she mentioned spending summers near Traverse City, and the conversation flowed without effort. When the music shifted to something slow but upbeat, she made a casual comment about how no one seemed willing to start the dancing. I shrugged and offered my hand, nothing theatrical, just polite. We danced once. It was light, respectful, a comfortable distance maintained without question. My hand rested properly at her upper back, not drifting, not lingering. There was no intimacy layered beneath it, no coded glances. It was exactly what Olivia had insisted dancing was supposed to be. But I was aware of Olivia's eyes on us. Not subtly either. I could feel the weight of her stare across the room. When the song ended, I thanked Hannah and stepped away without prolonging anything. I resumed conversations as if nothing significant had occurred, because to me, it hadn't. The drive home was quiet at first, the kind of silence that vibrates instead of settles. Then Olivia broke it. Her voice was sharper than it had been in weeks. You were flirting with her. The accusation came out controlled but edged with something she hadn't shown before. It wasn't anger exactly. It was irritation mixed with disbelief. I kept my eyes on the road and answered calmly, without inflection. I thought dancing was harmless. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smirk. I simply repeated her own logic back to her, stripped of emotion. The words hung between us in the dark car, illuminated only by passing streetlights cutting across the windshield. For the first time since the gala, she didn't have a comeback. There was no quick dismissal, no labeling me dramatic, no sarcastic laugh. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It wasn't me withdrawing. It was her recalculating. And I realized in that moment that becoming untouchable was not about revenge or theatrics. It was about removing access to my reactions. When I stopped reacting, she no longer knew which version of me she was dealing with. 2 months after the neighborhood mixer, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a plain manila envelope wedged between utility bills and a grocery store flyer. There was no return address, no identifying marks, just my name written in simple block letters. The weight of it was slight but deliberate. I stood there in the driveway for a few seconds longer than necessary, the quiet of the suburban street pressing in around me, before walking inside. I did not open it immediately. I placed it on the kitchen counter and stared at it while the house sat empty, Olivia still at work. I already knew what it likely contained. After the gala, one of my friends, without dramatics or commentary, had connected me with a private investigator he trusted. I had not hired him out of rage. I had hired him because something in my instincts refused to quiet down, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it. The envelope was the result of patience. Inside was a flash drive and a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in clean, unembellished handwriting. 4 months. Be smart. No signature. No explanation. None was necessary. I felt no surge of adrenaline, no trembling hands. Just a steady, controlled awareness that the moment I inserted that drive into my laptop, whatever ambiguity remained would disappear. I waited until evening, until Olivia mentioned she was meeting a friend for drinks, before sitting alone in my home office. The room was dim except for the light of the screen. When the files opened, they were organized methodically. Dates. Times. Locations. The first folder contained screenshots of text messages between her and Derek. There was no mistaking the tone. Intimate jokes. References to nights that were clearly not spin class. Complaints about me framed as playful but cutting. Plans arranged with precision, always when I was traveling or distracted. The familiarity in their language went beyond flirtation. It was established. Comfortable. The next folder held photographs taken from a distance, grainy but unmistakable. Rooftop bars downtown, her silhouette against city lights, his hand resting confidently at her waist. They were not posed like two people who happened to run into each other. They leaned into one another like a couple accustomed to proximity. A series of images showed them entering a hotel lobby on separate timelines, careful but not careful enough. Another showed them leaving together hours later. Then there was a video file. It was short, filmed outside a jazz lounge I recognized immediately because we had once celebrated an anniversary there. The camera angle was discreet but clear. They stood near the entrance, laughing about something inaudible, and then she reached for him first. The kiss was not hesitant. It was practiced. Familiar. The kind of kiss that does not belong to someone testing boundaries for the first time. The timeline in the investigator's summary was precise. The affair had started 6 months before the gala. 6 months before the dance I had been told I was dramatic about. By the time she laughed in my face under the chandelier lights, she was not flirting. She was already deeply involved. The slow dance was not spontaneous or harmless. It was a calculation. A public experiment to measure how much disrespect I would absorb without consequence. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence of the room settle around me. Strangely, I did not feel shocked. The evidence did not shatter me because the fracture had happened long before. What I felt instead was confirmation. Every instinct I had questioned, every moment I had been told I was overreacting, lined up neatly with timestamps and file names. There was something almost clinical about it. I did not storm out of the office. I did not confront her when she came home later that night, carrying the faint scent of perfume and city air. I greeted her the same way I had for weeks, calm and unreadable. After she went to bed, I transferred every file to an encrypted folder, backed it up to a secure drive, and stored copies in more than one place. I labeled everything carefully. Dates. Correspondence. Visual evidence. I archived it all without a single word to her. The shift in our dynamic did not happen overnight, but once it became noticeable, it unsettled her in ways she could not mask. When I stopped orbiting her, stopped asking where she was going, stopped reacting to late returns or vague explanations, something in her composure began to crack. At first it was subtle. She started canceling girls' nights that she used to guard fiercely, offering flimsy excuses about being tired or needing a quiet evening at home. She began cooking elaborate dinners during the week, dishes that required preparation and attention, plating them carefully as if presentation alone could restore something unspoken between us. The kitchen filled with rich smells and soft music, and she would watch me as I ate, searching my face for a reaction that never came. She initiated intimacy more often, reaching for me in ways that felt urgent rather than affectionate. There was a desperation beneath her touch that hadn't been there before, as if she were trying to reclaim territory she sensed slipping away. I responded without cruelty but without enthusiasm, controlled and distant, never fully withdrawing yet never fully present. The balance confused her. She could not accuse me of neglect, yet she could not feel me leaning in. Then there were the tears. They appeared unpredictably, sometimes over trivial things, like a misplaced receipt or a minor disagreement about weekend plans. She would wipe at her eyes and say she didn't know why she felt so overwhelmed lately. I would hand her tissues and remain quiet, watching the conflict flicker behind her expressions. Guilt has a way of surfacing in fragments, and I could see it working through her even if she refused to name it. One rainy evening the tension finally snapped. The sky had been gray all day, heavy clouds pressing low over the neighborhood, and by the time we finished dinner the windows were streaked with water. The house felt smaller in that weather, the air thick and unmoving. She had been restless all afternoon, pacing between rooms, starting tasks and abandoning them halfway through. I was in the living room reading when she suddenly stood in front of me, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and something close to fear. "Do you even care about us anymore?" she demanded, her voice sharper than it had been in months. The question was not calm or measured. It was accusatory, almost wounded. For the first time, she looked unsure of her footing. I closed the book slowly and met her eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I asked her quietly, "Did you care when you were in his hotel room?" The words were steady, deliberate, each one placed carefully in the space between us. The color drained from her face instantly. It was not the reaction of someone confused by an accusation. It was the reaction of someone whose private fear had just been spoken aloud. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For a brief second, the only sound in the room was the rain hitting the glass. I had not shown her the screenshots. I had not mentioned the rooftop bars, the jazz lounge, the footage of them entering a hotel separately and leaving together. I had offered no evidence, no dates, no specifics. Yet she did not ask what I meant. She did not laugh and call me dramatic. She did not challenge the claim. She simply stared at me, pale and exposed, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. That was when I understood something important. The evidence was stored safely on multiple drives, archived and organized, but I did not need to reveal it to confirm the truth. The guilt was already living inside her, active and corrosive. It had been surfacing in canceled plans, forced affection, random tears. My silence had given it space to grow. And now, with a single question, it had stepped fully into the light. I did not elaborate. I did not press further. I simply held her gaze long enough for the weight of the moment to settle, then returned to my seat, leaving the rain and her silence to fill the room. I did not choose a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation planned around a holiday or an anniversary. On a quiet Saturday morning, while Olivia was out running errands, I sat in the home office and began printing everything. Page after page slid out of the printer in a steady rhythm, the mechanical sound almost meditative. Screenshots of text messages, each one time-stamped. Photographs labeled with dates and locations. Still frames pulled from video footage. Hotel entries and exits aligned chronologically. I organized them by month, starting from when the investigator confirmed the affair began, 6 months before the gala where she laughed in my face. I used a highlighter to mark key dates, the ink bright and undeniable against white paper. There was nothing emotional about the process. It felt administrative, like assembling documents for an audit. When I finished, I laid everything out across the desk in precise rows. Months separated by subtle gaps. Conversations grouped together. Images placed beside corresponding timestamps. It was not chaotic. It was clear. I left the office door open on purpose, the papers fully visible from the hallway, and then I went downstairs and made coffee. I did not pace. I did not rehearse lines. I simply waited. She found it within minutes of coming home. I heard her footsteps slow as she passed the office, then stop entirely. There was no immediate reaction. No shouting my name. No slammed door. Instead, there was the faint, unmistakable sound of paper being lifted and turned. A single sheet sliding over another. The soft friction of evidence meeting air. The house felt suspended, every other sound swallowed by that quiet shuffling. I stayed in the kitchen, leaning lightly against the counter, listening. Page after page turned. The rhythm slowed as she moved deeper into the timeline. I imagined her recognizing specific messages, remembering specific nights. Then the paper stopped moving. Silence stretched thin between rooms. And then I heard it. The smallest broken sob I have ever heard. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just a fracture in her breathing that she could not suppress. When she finally walked into the kitchen, she looked smaller somehow. Her eyes were red but dry, shock overtaking tears. She did not deny it. She did not accuse me of invading her privacy. She did not call me dramatic. Instead, she began reaching for explanations that sounded fragile even as she spoke them. She said she did not mean for it to go that far. She said it was not supposed to be serious. She said she felt invisible. Each sentence came out uneven, like she was trying on justifications to see which one might soften the damage. I listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in watching her unravel. No surge of vindication. Just a steady acknowledgement that everything I had sensed was now laid bare between us, printed in black and white. When she said she felt invisible, I thought about the gala, about her laughing when I asked her not to dance with him, about being told I was dramatic. I thought about the months she had lived a double narrative, confident I would never piece it together. When she finished speaking, when the room settled into that fragile stillness again, I said one thing. You made it real. My voice did not rise. I did not list the evidence. I did not recite dates. I did not accuse her of destroying anything. I simply stated what the documents already proved. Whatever loneliness she claimed, whatever dissatisfaction she tried to frame as context, she had chosen action. She had stepped beyond frustration and into betrayal. There was no rage in me at that moment, no impulse to humiliate her further. The truth was already doing the work. The papers on the desk were not there to hurt her. They were there to remove any space left for distortion. No gaslighting. No reframing. Just a timeline she could not argue with. She stood there in the kitchen, the weight of it pressing down, and I realized that the quiet I had carried since that night at the gala was no longer hollow. It was final. A week after the evidence covered our office desk and the truth settled permanently into the walls of the house, I received the finalized divorce papers from Madeline. They were clean, precise, absent of emotional language, just structured paragraphs outlining the division of assets and the formal end of a 7-year marriage. I read through them once more at the dining room table early that morning, the house still quiet, and felt no tremor in my hands. The decision had already been made long before ink met paper. This was simply the administrative confirmation of it. The night before, Olivia had tried one last symbolic gesture. She set a bottle of unopened Pinot Noir in the center of the table, the same brand we used to buy during our first year of marriage when we still believed small rituals could anchor us. 2 glasses stood beside it, carefully placed, like a scene waiting to be played out. She did not open it. She left it there as an offering, a quiet suggestion that we could sit down, pour it, and somehow rewind to a version of ourselves untouched by what she had done. The bottle remained sealed. That morning, I placed the envelope containing the divorce papers beside the wine. The contrast was almost starkly poetic, her attempt at reconciliation next to the legal dismantling of our life together. I did not announce what it was. I simply set it down and stepped back. She walked into the dining room a few minutes later, still in her robe, her hair loosely pulled back. Her eyes moved from the bottle to the envelope, then back again, as if trying to make sense of the pairing. When she picked up the envelope and saw her name typed neatly on the front, her fingers tightened slightly around the edge. She did not open it immediately. She looked at me instead, her voice barely above a whisper when she asked if this was really happening. I held her gaze steadily and asked one question in return. Was kissing him also just dancing? The words were not sharp. They were not shouted. They were measured and calm, anchored in the same quiet tone I had carried for months. There was no performance in it, no attempt to wound her further. It was a reminder of the beginning, of the night she laughed at me under chandelier lights and told me I was being dramatic. She did not answer. Her eyes lowered to the envelope again, and whatever argument she might have formed dissolved before it reached her lips. The absence of denial was louder than any confession. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything that had already been said over printed pages and broken sobs. I picked up my keys from the counter. There was no dramatic speech waiting inside me, no final list of grievances to unload. The evidence had spoken. The questions had been asked. The line had been drawn the moment she chose him over the boundary I had set in that ballroom. Walking toward the front door felt less like leaving in anger and more like stepping into something inevitable. When I opened the door, the morning air was cool and steady. I did not slam it behind me. I did not yell her name. I did not pause in the doorway hoping she would call me back with some last revelation that would alter the trajectory we were on. I walked forward with the same controlled pace I had maintained since the night everything shifted. Some men scream when they are betrayed. Some beg for explanations that only deepen the humiliation. I chose something else. I chose to see the situation exactly as it was, without distortion, without minimization, without rage clouding it. I chose clarity.